Hello, I'm Devin Lange. I'm a PhD student at the University of Utah and a member of the Visualization Design Lab. I will be presenting work done by myself, Shaurya Sahai, Jeff Phillips, and Alexander Lex. In this presentation, I will discuss academic misconduct, specifically the fabrication and falsification of tabular datasets. In addition, I will discuss our ideas and contributions towards battling this problem. We believe that most scientists work hard to expand knowledge and improve society. Unfortunately, some cheat, which can lead to devastating consequences. One notable example of this is key Alzheimer's research that is now in question. This research led to 15 years of misguided focus in the scientific community, as well as the development of pharmaceutical drugs. All of this work now has a massive question mark above it because the foundational research contains data that appears to be manipulated. And this is just one example of many troubling cases in just the last few years. So, what can we do? First, we can look at what is already being done for similar problems. Plagiarism in writing is something that editors of journals check for with purpose-built software such as Authenticate. Tools also exist for detecting duplicated regions in image data, often a sign that the data has been manipulated. But what about tabular datasets? Let's examine another story. In this particular story, we look at a junior research faculty member, Dr. Kate Laskowski. Early in her career, she started a new collaboration with a prominent member of her field who provided the data for a paper they published together about the behavior of spiders. Later, after closer investigation, she determined the tabular datasets he provided could not be trusted. In this incredibly difficult situation, she's decided to retract the paper and publish a blog chronicling the story about how she came to her conclusions for this data. I would like to propose 3 high-level steps we can take in the scientific community to help prevent the manipulation of tabular datasets. First, it's important to understand properties of manipulated data. Next, I think there's room to create more tools to help identify manipulated data. And finally, we must consider how best to implement best practices both individually and as a community to reduce data manipulation. To begin, understanding fraud can be challenging due to the adversarial nature of this topic. The way that we approached this for our work was by examining tabular datasets associated with retracted papers or papers that had an expression of concern issued. We also reviewed the public arguments for why these papers should be retracted. Ultimately, we found 10 datasets from the field of biology, medicine, psychology, and marketing. We have labeled each with a unique key. After investigating all these datasets, we identified patterns that exist across them. One pattern that we identified is unexpected formatting, which I will discuss in detail later. We also recorded the 4 datasets that exhibit this pattern. We did this for 7 other patterns and organized them into 4 higher-level themes: formatting, numerical, structural, and domain. We refer to these patterns as artifacts of manipulation. You may notice that we have included unexpected leading digits as an artifact, even though we did not identify it in any of our datasets. This is because Benford's law, which describes the expected frequency of leading digits, is a well-established technique for identifying fraud, especially in financial data. However, we found that the criteria required to run this test were frequently not met. Our goal was to organize these artifacts so that they are general enough to cover a wide range of scenarios while still being useful, and we believe we have successfully struck that balance. However, we acknowledge that there are artifacts that we may not have captured. So, we have created a living document online that lists what we have found and invites others to suggest changes or additions to this document. Moving on to the second point. Right now, there's a gap in tools to aid in data forensics for tabular data. For plagiarism, there are purpose-built tools such as Authenticate, which are widely used, but to our knowledge, no such tool exists for tabular data. There are various statistical tests that can check for the plausibility of data, such as Benford's law, or determining the probability that a dataset contains a duplicate number. However, these require careful setup and cannot always be used. Furthermore, we worry that applying these tests when it isn't appropriate would result in false positives viewed with high confidence by the user because they come with the authority of rigorous math. As a result, our tool highlights these artifacts of manipulation, but also embeds advice on what can cause the artifact, including benign causes. Introducing Ferret. On the left-hand side, a list of analyses is available. Each analysis is designed to highlight a different artifact. The analysis explanation is the embedded advice. It introduces the pattern, explains what to look for, and gives warnings on how it could be misinterpreted. The summary charts provide aggregate information about the column of data below. Even though the visual encodings are simple, the data transformations performed are carefully crafted to surface artifacts of manipulation. Finally, the tabular visualization gives access to the raw data. So we've talked about these two ideas of understanding fraud and creating tools. Clearly, they are linked. Understanding fraud directly guided the design choices of Ferret. In other words, once you know the patterns, you can create tools to highlight them. Now, I will spend some time going into the details for some of the artifacts of manipulation. For details on the others, please refer to the paper or the living document of artifacts. To begin, I will discuss unexpected formatting with an example from the driving dataset. Formatting here does not refer to the values of the data, but rather things that change the appearance of the data in formatting tools like Microsoft Excel. This includes things like the font size, and methods of text emphasis such as bold, italic, or underlined. Variation in formatting is not automatically suspicious. For instance, it is common to emphasize column headers. However, there can be more subtle variations. Unless you have an incredibly keen eye, you probably didn't notice that I've formatted these numbers in two different fonts. While not immediately incriminating, I would consider this to be suspicious, or at the very least strange, and worth investigating further. This exact pattern exists in one of the retracted datasets. This column represents the odometer reading for 13,488 cars. Since formatting difference can be visually subtle, we do not recreate them in the tool. Instead, we choose to highlight when there are differences. In this case, blue for Cambria font and white for Calibri font. Switching to overview mode lets more rows fit on the screen, and sorting the data reveals some interesting patterns. All of the values of 0 in this data are in the white font. Most of the values between 300 and 1,000 are blue. Scrolling through the data, we can see regions of white at round numbers, but we don't see the same effect for the blue values. Lastly, skipping to the largest values in the dataset, if we select all of these values and expand them, we can see that the fonts all alternate perfectly between blue and white. Moving on, I will discuss one type of numerical artifact. Numerical artifacts relate to the actual values recorded. Duplicate numbers and digits refer to when whole numbers or sequences of digits are repeated more frequently than expected. This can suggest that data may have been copy-pasted or manually entered. Evaluating if the number of duplicates is more than expected requires understanding the position of the data and the number of samples. Finding a few duplicates in a large dataset is not suspicious, but finding many duplicates in small datasets may warrant a closer look. This dataset represents the amount of time in seconds it takes for a spider to re-emerge from its enclosure. A proxy for that spider's boldness. 600 or 10 minutes is duplicated many times in this dataset. However, the experiment was capped at 10 minutes, so it's reasonable to ignore that in our analysis. In this dataset, there are many values that are duplicated 2 or 3 times. Selecting values will highlight them and bring them to the top of our list. Structural artifacts relate to the values of spreadsheets, as well as their position within the spreadsheet. A region refers to multiple cells with a spatial relationship. This could mean cells that are adjacent in columns or rows, or even nearby cells with gaps in between them. In some scenarios, a few duplicate numbers may be a weak signal of manipulation or not suspicious at all. But repeated regions are a much stronger signal that something suspicious is happening. Our last example that we looked at actually includes an example of this. Finally, domain artifacts apply knowledge beyond the single dataset. In a given domain, there may be prior knowledge about what is an expected distribution for single-dimensional data or expected relationships between multidimensional data. We consider deviations from these expectations to be artifacts. Let's consider a hypothetical dataset that measures the height and weight of people. It is possible that more sophisticated techniques for generating fabricated data, such as scripts, may not leave behind the earlier artifacts we've discussed. Furthermore, the distribution of each column may also match domain expectations. However, if columns are generated independently, they may exhibit strange relationships, such as no correlation when there should be one, or even one that's opposite from expectations, as seen here where taller people tend to weigh less. In this case, it isn't difficult to think of ways to generate two columns with appropriate relationships, but this gets more difficult as you introduce more columns. Every additional column introduces a new set of relationships that can expose a potential flaw in the data fabrication process. Looking again at the driving dataset, we can look at two columns interactions: the odometer readings of cars at one point in time, and the odometer reading of the same car later in time. Each point corresponds to a single car. A point here would be a car that started with 0 miles on their odometer and ended with approximately 25,000 miles. And this would be a car that started at roughly 100,000 miles and ended at 125,000 miles. The points on this line correspond to cars that drove 0 miles in this time period. Similarly, the cars on this line drove exactly 50,000 miles. We can notice in this plot here that there are 0 cars that drove more than 50,000 miles, despite many driving near the boundary. That brings us to our last main point. Preventing manipulation of data will require more than just tools and knowledge. It will require changes to the policies and best practices of the scientific community. One idea we think is worth exploring is for journal editors to review datasets for manipulation, similarly to how they currently check for plagiarism. Individuals can also perform similar checks when they receive data from their collaborators. This is a difficult problem, and we don't claim to have all the answers. There are potential unintended consequences with this work. For instance, false positives could still lead to misguided accusations. Because of this, we believe tools like ours should be used in the review process, where authors can respond to concerns with their data, and the result is a rejected paper, not an accusation that can threaten an author's career. There's also a possibility that the bad actors could use tools like ours to improve their falsification data. And while some may do this, what we have seen with existing plagiarism tools is they still continue to catch many instances of cheating. Still, it is important to consider these types of broader impacts. We discuss these two concerns, as well as others, in more detail in our paper. At the end of the day, even after spending so much time looking at these cases of data manipulation, we still believe in the scientific community. But we can and should do more to prevent the manipulation of tabular datasets. We have taken a first step, and we urge you to consider how you can help the community understand fraud, build tools, and implement best practices.